I'm Dexter Van Zyl, Shulman Research Fellow for the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, and I'm going to be our host for this afternoon. At CAMERA, we examine the sources of information, and more often than not, sources of misinformation about Israel, Jews, in the Middle East. We look at claims that are made about the Jewish state and its supporters in the United States and other actors in the region. We look at the claims that are made in the media, by academics, and also in the wider culture. And we test the truth of the claims that are made about Israel and its supporters and other actors in the region. And when we find errors, we work hard to get people to set the record straight. It's frankly astonishing that Israel, such a small country, is the focus of so much dishonest propaganda and misinformation. To help us understand this troubling situation, we're going to be hearing today from CAMERA senior analyst Sean Durns. With a background in the study of terrorism and political violence, he worked for several think tanks and for a former high-ranking Pentagon official before joining CAMERA. His articles regularly appear in a variety of media outlets, including the Washington Examiner, the Washington Times, the Hill, and Jerusalem Post, and the Washington Jewish Week. Today, Sean will give us an insider's look at how the coverage of the Arab-Israeli conflict shapes the views of Beltway insiders. Sean's research shows that a counterfactual media coverage distorts public policy in the United States, and that's a problem that we're struggling to counter, and with your support, are making effective inroads. Before I invite Sean to present his research and recommendations, let me just say something quickly about the format. It will include first Sean's presentation for about 25 minutes, and this will be followed by a question and answer session with written questions that will be submitted through Zoom. If you run your cursor along the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a Q&A icon. Please click there and submit your questions during the talk. And then we will read these questions and get to as many of them as we can after the talk. We very much want to hear from you, but first let us hear from Sean. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you, Dexter, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'd like to begin with a revealing quote which I think sums up how the press sees itself. The late president of the Washington Post, Philip Graham, once observed that journalism is the first rough draft of history. Graham's observation is, of course, correct, but journalism can also make history as well. Journalism can make history by setting an agenda. And the truth of the matter is that journalism today is often a field of battle for different interests to advance their policy objectives. Policy battles and arguments are fought, won, and lost, not just in the halls of Congress or in some bureaucrat's office, but out there in public in the pages of publications. Every day, for example, in almost every congressional and Senate office, interns, administrative assistants, and legislative correspondents come in, read an assigned list of newspapers, and prepare media briefing packets. These packets are distributed to senior staff and the congressional members who either read them and are briefed on them. This allows members and their staffs to have an understanding of ongoing debates, conversations, and to get a feel for what the national mood might be. Sometimes members and their senior staff will ask for briefings on certain issues. Oftentimes, for example, they'll rely on the Congressional Research Service, a nonpartisan entity for their research needs. CRS, however, also relies on newspapers for their reports and research. Thus, the media has a tremendous ability to set the agenda from which talking points and their priorities will be drawn from. And certain outlets are more influential than others. Large newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times are, of course, influential, almost regardless of where the member is from and whom he or she is representing. These outlets often provide a broad framework of what is and potentially what will be debated, discussed, and possibly put into law on the Hill. The Times, the Post, and others like them are the chief news aggregators. Local outlets, however, can be equally important. A member from, say, Richmond, Virginia, or Baltimore, Maryland is going to give a lot more weight to what their local newspaper says than, say, CNN or a paper that is out of state or out of district. These local papers are, after all, the ones that deal with the whole fulcrum of their concerns. It's what their constituents read. One prominent battlefield of ideas is the Washington, D.C.-based newspaper, The Hill. One of the first things that I do every day, for example, is read the op-ed section in The Hill, which is widely read by congressional staff and members. From it, I can discern how certain interest groups are trying to advance agendas. If, for example, I see a bunch of pieces talking about how great of an ally Lebanon is to the United States or how essential Lebanon is to the US and the Middle East, I can fairly well guess that the US Congress is probably about to examine and potentially approve or disapprove aid to Lebanon. These op-eds seldom appear by happenstance, and they're often the work of nonprofit organizations or individuals that have been directly or indirectly commissioned to write them. Those writing them do so with the hope and goal of influencing policy. These are often lobbying campaigns in all but name. But it's not just the opinion and editorial sections that drive policy. Reporting does as well. And indeed, this has always been the case when it comes to the United States and the Middle East. Historians differ as to when the press truly began to influence US foreign policy. But there's evidence that the media had an impact on US policy in the Middle East as early as the 19th century. In 1876, for example, the Ottoman Turks massacred 15,000 Bulgarian Christians. An enterprising reporter from Ohio, and I'm probably going to butcher this name, but his name is Januarius McGann, filed reports on the massacres, which were then reprinted by the New York Times and described as, quote, churches packed full of corpses, and including the remains of babes and little children slaughtered by the hundreds, and bodies of maidens first violated and then murdered. McGann's reporting helped turn opinion in the United States and elsewhere against the Ottoman Empire, and led to support for Russia in the 1878 war, which led to Bulgaria separating from the Ottoman Empire. In the 1890s, US media outlets like the New York Times, which ran a September 1895 headline entitled Armenian Holocaust, stirred US public outrage against Ottoman persecution of Armenian Christians. As the historian Michael Oren documented, the American press was virtually unanimous in calling for urgent action to save the Armenians. The issue quickly became political, and in his 1896 presidential platform, William McKinley listed, quote, saving the Armenians, end quote, as a top foreign policy priority. Eventually, after continued support from the media and elsewhere, in December 1900, the US sent a naval ship to exert pressure on the Ottomans, which subsequently paid compensation to massacred missionaries. Revelations by the press of the massacre of Armenians during the early stages of World War I would later stir US outrage against the Ottoman Empire and play a key role in American public opinion turning against the Central Powers in World War I. Indeed, the US ambassador to the empire, Henry Morgenthau, used his friendship with the New York Times publisher, Adolph Oakes, to ensure that the Armenian genocide received regular coverage. Yet Oakes, who was an anti-Zionist Jew, would use the New York Times to squelch all articles on Zionism, as Michael Oren has noted. As my camera colleagues have documented, the Times has changed very little in its hostility to Zionism. Yet other influential outlets of the time, such as Harper's Weekly, would go on to support the right of Jewish self-determination in the Jewish people's ancestral homeland. A few decades later, in the battle for popular opinion, the Zionist Hillel Cook, also known as Peter Bergson, would take out newspaper ads, put on plays, and obtain celebrity endorsements in favor of a Jewish army to fight the Nazis, and subsequently for the support of the recreation of the Jewish state. As we all know, President Harry Truman would go on to support the recreation of Israel. Dispatches at the time by a young 22-year-old Boston Post reporter, published in June 1948, also helped stir up American popular support for Israel, noting that, quote, the Arabs in command believe that eventually victory must be theirs. It is against all law and nature that this Jewish state should exist. They promise that if it does become a reality, it will never have as neighbors anything but hostile countries, which will continue the fight militarily and economically until victory is achieved. The Jews, on the other hand, this Boston Post reporter noted, believe that in a few more years, if a Jewish state is formed, it will be the only stabilizing factor remaining in the Near and Middle East. The Arab world is made up of many disgruntled factions, which would have been at each other's throats long ago if it had not been for the common war against Zionism. That young Boston Post reporter was a man named Robert Francis Kennedy. He would go on to be Attorney General and a U.S. Senator, and would, during his 1968 presidential run, be murdered by a Palestinian American, Sirhan Sirhan, for his support of Israel during the Six-Day War. I'd like to highlight some more recent examples as well of how the press influences policy. In 2017 and 2018, for example, both the United States and Israel sought to end the policy of the Palestinian Authority known as pay to slay, in which the authority pays money to those who attack or murder Jews and whom they think are Jews. The US Congress sought to pass legislation called the Taylor Force Act, which is named after a U.S. veteran and a college student who was murdered by a Palestinian terrorist who mistakenly believed that he was Jewish. In order to prevent U.S. taxpayer funds from indirectly funding terrorism, after all, money is fungible, the U.S. House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed the Taylor-Force Act on December 5, 2017. A press release by the House Foreign Affairs Committee noted that the legislation, quote, restricts U.S. assistance to the Palestinian Authority unless it stops subsidizing terrorists through pay-to-slay policies. In 2018, however, the Senate held up the legislation. This was done in concert with an active press campaign that sought to prevent the act from becoming policy. The Washington Post, for example, ran a misleading March 14, 2018 fact-checker column, which minimized and obfuscated on the PA's policy of paying for terrorism. Relying on questionable sources, the Post cited, quote, documentation provided by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, formerly a U.S. designated terrorist group, and one that is led by the same man who leads the Palestinian Authority itself, Mahmoud Abbas. Worse still, the Post cited research about Palestinian prisoners that was provided by Defense for Children International Palestine, a group tied to the U.S. designated terrorist group, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Indeed, the secretary of DCIP's board, Fatima Dana, is the widow of the commander of PFLP's Abu Ali Mustafa Brigades, a terror group. One DCI employee, Hashem Abu Maria, was celebrated by the PFLP as a commander of the terrorist group after his 2014 death. Trusting terrorist-linked entities for a fact check on terrorist payments is pretty poor journalism. The Post even trotted out the tired cliche that, quote, one man's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, and claimed that, quote, a big problem is just definitional. The PA doesn't list payments to terrorists and their families, but instead uses words such as Palestinian prisoners and martyrs. Well, we all know what that means. Similarly, The Hill published an op-ed which claimed that the payments were merely, quote, social welfare, end quote. Camera responded by kicking into high gear, publishing op-eds in both The Hill and the Washington Examiner, which corrected the misleading information provided in The Hill and by the Washington Post's so-called fact checker. Eventually, through a concerted effort by several groups and supporting lawmakers, the Taylor-Force Act was passed. Another blatant example of how the press influences policy can be seen in recent efforts to reform UNRWA. In 2018 and 2019, part of the U.S. administration wanted to cut funds from the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. In another concerted PR campaign, outlets like Foreign Policy Magazine, The Washington Post, again, and others ran opinion pieces, editorials, and reporting which depicted the cuts as harmful and omitted the administration's stated reason for supporting them. These were clearly meant to influence popular opinion and influence policymakers. Again, Camera kicked into high gear, authoring more than 8 articles and op-eds, including a piece in the Post itself, which noted that UNRWA employees had a history of documented anti-Semitism, had employed terror operatives, and used a curriculum that calls for abolishing Israel. As Camera wrote in the Washington Post, highlighting the newspaper's omission, UNRWA's politicized definition of refugee is not dependent on need and also applies to citizens of recognized states, allowing, for example, wealthy third-generation Jordanian citizens to be considered Palestinian, quote, refugees. Also left unsaid, the organization's demand for a right to return to a country that many were never born in negates the idea of Palestinian statehood, unless that state means, by its definition, the demographic end of the Jewish nation of Israel. So the Post published our rebuttal, which clarified those points. Well, these are very obvious lobbying campaigns. Sometimes the press's influence on policy can be more subtle. The press can influence the policy debates by what it chooses not to report as well. For that, I'd like to draw your attention to a perennial habit of the press, which I call the missing piece. It is common for the press to report on the peace process and or the lack of a Palestinian state. But policymakers, as well as the public that they serve, might be surprised to learn that in fact, Palestinians have had numerous offers for statehood, and they have rejected all of them if it meant living peacefully next to a Jewish state. In 1937, 1947, 1967, 2000, 2001, 2008, 2014, and 2016, and most recently, 2019, the British, the United Nations, the US, and Israel have all variously offered the Palestinians the chance for something which never existed, a sovereign Palestinian Arab state. In every single instance, these proposals and offers were rejected. And in not one instance did Palestinians show that they were willing to accept Israel's legitimacy and right to exist. Yet how often is this reported? In one 2018 study of the Washington Post, Camera found that in 24 plus reports on the peace process over the last 2 years, not one mentioned these rejected offers. That's a purposeful and regrettably influential case of amnesia. Small wonder then that many voters and officials aren't aware of the reason for the lack of a Palestinian state. The first draft of history declines to mention it. This, of course, has a negative influence on U.S. policy and attitudes towards Israel. It's hard not to draw the conclusion that this omission is purposeful, particularly given the overwhelming evidence, including memoirs of participants and statements by Palestinian leaders themselves, which confirm it. Similarly, the press has played a key role in whitewashing the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, enabling it to gain more widespread acceptance by policymakers. In the last few years, we've seen greater support for BDS by both the press as well as in the halls of Congress, with new vocal members like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib expressing support for BDS. BDS, Washington Post columnist Paul Waldman claimed, merely, quote, opposes the Israeli government's occupation of Palestinian territories and treatment of Palestinians. Elsewhere, Washington Post op-eds have described BDS as merely seeking, quote, the end of Israeli occupation of Arab territory, the full equality of Palestinian citizens of Israel, and the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. How innocuous. Of course, that's not what BDS is about, no matter what the Post or certain members of Congress claim. BDS seeks to unfairly malign the world's sole Jewish state, singling it out for opprobrium. BDS co-founder Omar Barghouti has openly called for the end of the Jewish nation of Israel. And according to U.S. congressional testimony by a former U.S. Treasury Department terror analyst named Jonathan Schanzer, some BDS groups have links to terrorist organizations like the PFLP. No other country in the world faces a systemic campaign to boycott it. Only the world's sole Jewish state. It's pretty revealing. But in Israel, Arabs sit on the Supreme Court, hold elected offices, and enjoy both a higher standard of living and greater political freedoms than anywhere else in the Middle East. By contrast, Palestinians living under the rule of Fatah in the West Bank or Hamas in the Gaza Strip do not have free and fair elections. And those who practice religions other than Islam are subjugated or worse. These facts yet are omitted by the press, which shapes the policy debate. Indeed, Washington Post writer Waldman has worked to obfuscate about anti-BDS legislation, claiming that a proposed piece of legislation called the Israel Anti-Boycott Act is, quote, part of a national effort once again driven by the right, but supported by many Democrats, to silence opposition to Israeli policy towards the Palestinians. Those who support the legislation, Waldman charges, are guilty of, quote, something ugly and undemocratic. Instead, Waldman quotes concerns by the ACLU that the bill would, quote, impose civil and criminal penalties on companies, small business owners, nonprofits, and even people acting on their behalf who engage in or otherwise support certain political boycotts. But as Eugene Kontorovich, an international law professor, noted in the Washington Post itself, the ACLU's claims are as weak as they are dramatic. Kontorovich pointed out, if the anti-boycott measures are unconstitutional, as the ACLU argues, it would mean that most foreign sanctions laws are unconstitutional. If refusing to do business with a country is protected speech because it could send a message of opposition to that country's policies, doing business would also be protected speech. Thus, anyone barred from doing business with Iran, Cuba, or Sudan would be free to do so if they said it was a message of support for the revolution or opposition to U.S. policy or whatever. As the law professor highlighted, the Israel anti-boycott is merely an update to an already existing anti-boycott law, which was first adopted in 1977 and aimed at the Arab states' boycott of Israel. A boycott that was initiated, by the way, in 1948, long before the Jewish state acquired the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria, and the Gaza Strip in the 1967 Six-Day War. Indeed, Arab states had called to boycott Jewish businesses in British-ruled Mandate Palestine as early as 1945, 3 years before Israel was recreated. BDS then has nothing to do with opposing Israeli occupation of the so-called West Bank, and efforts to counter it are hardly new or undemocratic. Yet this is but one of many examples of the press actively working to influence policies that curtail anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish discrimination. The Washington Post, for example, has seen fit to mischaracterize efforts to fight anti-Semitism. On December 11, 2019, President Donald Trump signed an executive order to protect Americans from anti-Semitic discrimination on college campuses. The order was largely based on the bipartisan Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, according to co-chairs of the Senate Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism, Senators Jackie Rosen of Nevada and Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma. It adheres even to guidelines first implemented by the Obama administration. So that's a strong bipartisan history. The order instructs all departments and agencies of the U.S. executive branch to apply the same prohibitions against forms of discrimination rooted in anti-Semitism as it does to discrimination based on race, color, or national origin, as stated in Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. It also instructs the executive branch to consider contemporary examples of anti-Semitism from the internationally accepted IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. The executive order contains no language defining Judaism as a national origin. Yet the Washington Post inaccurately asserted that, quote, the order by the president specifically targets colleges and universities by classifying Judaism not only as a religion, but also as a race or a nationality. But as the writer Jonathan Tobin noted, the notion that Trump was trying to redefine Judaism is just nonsense. As even magazine Slate pointed out, not exactly a friend of Israel, Trump's order was in line with past rulings by the George W. Bush Department of Education and Barack Obama's Justice Department. Yet the Post's editorial, as well as a December 12, 2019 article by reporter Ann Gearin and an op-ed by the far-left Rabbi Jill Jacobs, omitted all of that precedence. And neither the editorial nor Gearin's report noted that numerous countries and governmental agencies, including the U.S. State Department, have adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Indeed, as the ADL noted in a press release supporting the order, the executive order includes Jews in Title VI protections, something that ADL and previous administrations, both Democratic and Republican, have supported for years. In so doing, the order is very similar to the proposed Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. It directs the Departments of Education and Justice to consider the IHRA definition in determining whether an investigation of an incident of anti-Semitism is warranted. In contrast to the Post's claim that the order deals with campus incidents too broadly by threatening to suppress speech, the ADL noted that under the order, criticism of Israel may be considered protected speech, but the line must be drawn when such expression becomes intentional, unlawful, discriminatory intimidation, and harassment. Tellingly, neither the paper's editorial or its reporting spent any bit of time detailing the hostility that Jewish students face on campus. As one audit of anti-Semitic incidents noted, in only 2 years, there's been an 86% increase in reported anti-Semitic incidents at colleges and universities, from 108 incidents in 2016 to 201 in 2018. Regrettably, I'm sure at the end of this year, we'll find that even went up. As some of you might be aware, the University of Delaware's Chabad House was set on fire within the last couple days here. This accounts for a total of 10% of the reported anti-Semitic incidents. Yet the Washington Post chooses to misleadingly depict the executive order as misguided because it only deals with, quote, academia, when so many hateful occurrences have occurred at synagogues, Jewish cemeteries, and elsewhere. When not attempting to fight legislation that protects Jewish students, many in the press are providing cover for anti-Semites. Many media outlets devoted considerable coverage, for example, to Israel's decision to bar entry to U.S. Congresswomen Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. Both members of Congress support the BDS movement. Yet most major news outlets, including the Washington Post, USA Today, and Politico, failed to note that MIFTA, an organization that has praised suicide bombers and accused Jews of consuming Christian blood, sponsored Omar and Tlaib's planned trip. USA Today was even provided with documents from NGO Monitor, an organization which tracks nonprofits, revealing MIFTA's sordid history. But they declined to include that information in an update to an August 15, 2019 dispatch on Omar and Tlaib's planned trip. The Washington Post, which filed a report, an op-ed, and editorial opposing efforts to fight anti-Semitism on campus, couldn't spare a word about 2 members of Congress planning to go on a trip sponsored by an organization that traffics in blood libels. Camera, however, responded by authoring 5 op-eds on the matter and alerting editors at the Washington Examiner and other newspapers to MIFTA's history. Indeed, our coverage of the matter was noted by Hot Air, Town Hall, Breitbart, as well as on several podcasts, and we appeared on daily radio shows in Florida to highlight the matter. Our research even provided the foundation for a National Review article on the topic. But the fight continues. As we've seen, anti-Semitism is rising. It's tolerated at major Western news outlets. Indeed, it's even promoted. Those who seek to deny Jewish people rights granted to others, including that of self-determination, are giving microphones and increasingly large platforms. It's not only Jewry that is under attack, but the concept of liberal values as well. We've seen the direct ability of the press to influence policy in the Middle East, from the platform of William McKinley more than a century ago to BDS and the so-called peace process today. So this is why your support of CAMERA is essential. This is a perilous time, and we need your help now more than ever. Thank you.
Just a reminder for the audience, we'd love to hear from you. We have a number of questions already in the queue. If you run your cursor along the bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon for the Q&A. Click there, type your questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. One of the things that you mentioned was the Congressional Research Service. And how influential is it? And do you find it biased?
So CRS is extremely influential. It's very common for members of Congress. They're quite busy, and this is something we should always keep in mind, is that they're dealing with multiple issues. It's very difficult if you're a member of Congress to be an expert on one specific thing, whether it's Israel, the peace process, or what have you, or BDS. So you really are relying on others. You're relying on your staff, and you're relying on the Congressional Research Service to provide you with information that might help guide your legislative decisions. So CRS itself, of course, also relies on our media. And I do not think that many CRS analysts are inherently biased. I don't think that at all. I've seen no evidence of that. But, however, they do rely on a media that is extremely biased. I've seen CRS reports that reference favorably Al Jazeera, for example. So there is that potential for that information to get out there and affect a lawmaker's decision-making process.
Once a long, long time ago, I covered the commercial fishing industry for a magazine called National Fisherman. And the U.S. Senate had a field hearing in Boston. And so Senator John Kerry and Senator Ted Stevens came to Boston. And Senator John Kerry read the first 2 paragraphs of an article that I had written for National Fisherman. And to be frank, I got the willies. I was like, that's a U.S. senator that's relying on my information that I provided. And in that instance, it was good. But do the reporters in D.C. have any sense that this is what's going on, or are they just engaging in information warfare for its own sake? Do they know that they're actually being summarized by CRS and their information is actually being used to make decisions?
I think in some cases, yes. I think if you're at if you're at top outlets like, say, the Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, outlets that have a lot of national influence and sway, yes, I do think that many of them are aware that lawmakers will be reading what they're writing. And that also goes for outlets like The Hill or Roll Call or Politico that are more DC based, which we also deal with here at CAMERA.
Okay. Now, have you ever contacted or reached out to the communications directors or the chief of staffs or the appropriate people in congressional offices to say, hey, look, so-and-so got it wrong in like the Washington Post, or have you done that, or is that appropriate? Or
yes. So one thing that, of course, I should emphasize is CAMERA is a nonpartisan entity, and we don't take political stances. But that doesn't mean that we can't reach out to set the record straight to lawmakers on either side of the aisle, which we do. We do provide our research and articles to lawmakers and make sure they have access to that information.
Okay. Now, one of the questions is, has Barry Weiss's resignation from the New York Times had any impact on, one, the operations of the paper, and this may be beyond your ken, or did it have any ripple inside the Beltway?
That's a great question. I don't think so. I think that for many people, they saw it as confirmation of what they already knew. and for others, they were quick to dismiss it. I do think that for outside of the Beltway, for people that might have been sitting on the fence and weren't sure about, say, media bias or preconceived notions and predetermined reporting and narratives, I think that it might have moved them. I hope so, because it's quite clear that there's a problem here.
What about the Wall Street Journal? And what do you think of their coverage, and what type of influence do they have in the Beltway?
So I should first note that the Journal itself is not a paper that I cover. Other camera analysts do cover the Journal, but it is influential. It is absolutely influential. With a few exceptions, I'm pretty reluctant to paint with a broad brush any newspaper and characterize in general how their coverage of, say, Israel or the Middle East is. I think the Journal, from what I gather, is someone that just doesn't closely follow it compared to other outlets, has some good reporters and some bad ones, and same with other editors, but it is certainly an influential outlet in the Beltway. Absolutely.
Now, one of the things that I always think about is that I worked as a reporter at a chain of local newspapers outside of Boston, and also I worked for some trade publications. And if I got stuff wrong as a local reporter, and I walked into town meeting, or if I walked into the Board of Selectmen's office or the town manager's office, I'd get yelled at personally, in person, by people who I needed to have continue to talk to me.
Right.
But I get the sense that when you deal with an awful lot of the reporters, particularly those inside the Beltway, they don't really have a lot of direct interaction with the people who are downstream from their coverage. There's a certain kind of distance, which then contributes to disdain. Even as a reporter, sometimes I may not have liked the sources that I had to work with, but I still had to maintain a relationship with them. So I had to kind of quote them accurately and deal with them fairly, even if I might have been somewhat biased against them on a personal level. Okay. Does that happen in DC? Do you think there's a certain level of distance and disdain? And what, do we correct that, do you think?
So DC itself, there's the term of, the Beltway bubble. And in my judgment, that is 100% true. There is a bubble that reporters and others that live here and work in the policymaking community live in, which means generally that they don't accept criticism well, if they even hear it, if you're even able to criticize them. But that's also a broad statement. There are some reporters that we've dealt with here at Camera, here in DC, that have been very receptive. Same for some editors. They're open to criticism, and that allows us to ensure more accurate coverage and to correct mistakes. But as far as it being a very insulated environment for both press and policymakers, in my experience, that's absolutely true.
Okay. Now, what about the divide between like the national press and a congressman's local newspaper? Which are they going to give more privilege to or more weight to when it comes time to reading about the Middle East?
That's a fantastic question. The safest answer, as my old philosophy professor once said, is depends. So I think that it does depend. However, local news outlets can be extremely influential in terms of what a congressional office is going to be responsive to. And this is a place where Camera's had quite a bit of success. One example is the Richmond Times-Dispatch, which shortly after we first opened up our DC office here was a perennial problem, not so much for its reporting, but for its opinion section, and in particular, the letters to the editor. You had several anti-Israel activists that were very organized and that would write letters defaming Israel. Actually, many of them were connected to what you do, Dexter, in relations to, they worked for certain churches that were growing their anti-Israel animus. And so we worked to correct that, and we rebutted these letters. There's a similar experience with the Baltimore Sun. You had a couple, I would call them conspiracy theorists, that would routinely be published in the Sun, including one gentleman whose name I won't say, but his first name was Ray. And he loved to basically insinuate that Israel really liked war and these war-making Jews. Now it's the war-making Jewish state. That's how that anti-Semitic canard has been updated. And he would routinely publish these in the Sun, and no one was really pushing back. And so we started to do that. And sure enough, in both cases, it improved. Once you start to fight back, which I think is absolutely essential in today's age, if you value the truth and classical liberalism, you have to. And we noticed results with both the Richmond Times-Dispatch and Baltimore Sun, and that was just in my little sphere. So I think that there's probably numerous other stories of that being the case. But local outlets can be extremely influential, extremely so.
All right. Now, one of the things that I struggled with is as a local reporter is that sometimes the cranks will be the ones that will walk into your newsroom, okay? And they'll be the ones that will continually push at you. So at a certain point, they end up having more influence just because they're local and they play a larger role in your imagination as a reporter. And I guess how does camera push? How do you push back against that?
Well, with facts, and that's what camera brings to the table. We have the facts on our side. We have the facts. We have the expertise. Being so that we're nonpartisan, we're generally perceived as impartial, and which helps us considerably. So I think that is that's a huge part of it. You got to counter it with you can only counter darkness with light, and you need the facts on your side, and we've got the facts on our side. And the problem is that a lot of these people, they might not be large in number, but they're very vocal and they're very loud. And so you always have to push back. And that's what we do.
All right. Now, there's a question, what can be done when the major newspapers refuse to publish the articles by camera?
That's a fantastic question. And that does happen. So there are, thankfully, today, one of the positives, I guess you could say, about the media environment is that there are so many outlets out there. So there are so many places for us to still have a voice. So that helps. Also, our letter writing campaign and our fantastic letter writing team, they're just, they show no mercy and they go right after it. And I think that helps. That makes a big difference. No reporter or editor likes to see their inbox flooded with all the stories and all the highlights of what they got wrong.
Right.
And whether they'll admit it or not, that has a positive effect.
Right. Now, one of the questions that's been posted is how many times can you publish the same article when you want to make sure that people will see the article? And have you, because that's one of the things that we struggle with all the time is that oftentimes we end up having to repeat ourselves again and again to remind people of the same truths that they've been lying about in other instances. Do you get a sense of deja vu sometimes?
Yes, I do. But that's important because repetition is an essential part of messaging. And, this is, in some respects, it's a very simple conflict, the Israel Islamist conflict, as I prefer to call it. And in other respects, it's quite complicated in terms of the details of events and things that have happened, changing boundaries and what have you. So sometimes it's important to repeat these facts because, well, there's a lot of them and they're essential.
Now, are there any DC papers that actually support Israel and get it right?
So I really don't like to paint with a broad brush, but I'll say that there are good reporters here, absolutely, and there are good editors here that are fair and that are receptive to criticism. We don't expect everybody to get everything right all the time, especially in today's media environment where it's a 24/7 and it's all about breaking a story and competition is fierce. It's increasingly digitized. And you're relying sometimes on, say, a tweet for finding out what's going on. So that makes it a very difficult environment, I think, for your average reporter and editor. And so we really try at Camera not to have a hostile relationship with journalists and with their staff. And I think that benefits us because at the end of the day, we want what they should want, which is fair and accurate coverage.
All right. Now, this is going to sound like an off-the-wall question, but what's your favorite war story that you can share with the audience?
I don't know about a favorite war story, but I will share, and what I brought up in my talk, the fact that I provided a particular news outlet with proof of that 2 members of Congress were trying to go on a trip to Israel, labeled as Palestine in their itinerary. that was sponsored by an organization that claims Jews consume Christian blood.
Yeah.
How is that not a national news story?
Yeah.
And at a time of rising anti-Semitism, not only must it be, but it is, in my opinion, quite damning that it is not.
Yeah.
So the fact that I provided a certain news outlet, USA Today, with that, and they declined to include it in their coverage when they did an update, I thought was beyond the pale. And even for my cynicism and sometimes low expectations, that was shocking.
Right. Now, is it more effective to write for, and this is more for our supporters, but is it, and maybe it's not an either or question, but I'm going to present it as an either or question. Is it more effective to write directly to our elected representatives about the misinformation that they may be exposed to, or is it to write direct to the newspapers themselves?
So I think it's helpful to write to the newspapers themselves, but it does depend. And this is where individuals do come into play. Sometimes you'll have a particular new editor that is going to be much more receptive to fixing things. And sometimes some papers, increasingly very few of them, still have standards and ethics editors. And those are the people that generally you want to take your complaints to. Unfortunately, and this is part of the changing media environment as well, they've been basically pulled out of most newsrooms. Very few newsrooms nowadays have standards and ethics editors. But in an ideal world, that's who you really want to take your criticism to. But it depends. Sometimes reporters, sometimes editors, sometimes not. Sometimes they're quite thin-skinned. They're not going to be responsive, and you might want to go to somebody else.
Right. Now, how can we influence the people who write the op-eds that we can? Have you had any luck dealing with the op-ed writers themselves, or is it just dealing with the people who decide whether or not to print their stuff?
Generally, I think it's the latter. A lot of times, if somebody's writing an op-ed on a particular subject, they are doing so for their own reasons, and they have their own very concrete opinions. So you're not going to really push. You're not going to push, say, a professor from the American University in Beirut who has been towing the Hezbollah line for a couple decades to refashion her op-ed. But you can't highlight, geez, should the Washington Post or the Hill be running op-eds that are read by members of Congress, written by a professor who, obfuscates on who Hezbollah is and what they want.
Okay. Now, this is going to be kind of a maybe too blunt a question, but what do you do? Sometimes I get the sense that there are some reporters that are still trying to do journalism. And then there are other, maybe not journalists or commentators, that look like they're just engaged in, for lack of a better word, information warfare. How do you deal with those two different groups of people? Do you see that dichotomy, and what do you do when you're confronted with the latter, I guess? Or do you deal with those two species of writers different?
I think you deal with them differently. If somebody is a good faith actor and a good faith journalist, and they're out there to get the real story and accumulate all the facts and present them, not in a predetermined fashion, but present them for readers to decide, then you deal with that individual and say, okay, well, maybe you weren't aware of this fact, or this particular thing was incorrect in your report. But if somebody is blatantly coming from a place where they are just towing the line, they're an activist, effectively, they're not really a journalist, I don't think that you treat them like a good faith actor, because they're not.
Okay.
So you highlight their biases, you highlight what their real agenda is, and they have an agenda, and the incongruities of their reporting, if you want to call it that. And that's how you go for it. And you don't do it trying to move them. You do it trying to move the people that are reading their work and might not be aware of where this particular person is coming from.
Now, one of the things that we've seen, and we haven't commented too directly about it here at Camera, is that there seems to be a decline in advertising revenue for an awful lot of the media outlets that we're dealing with. And there's been a substantial number of layoffs. And yet at the same, and so that means that it's harder for them to get coverage from overseas. Have you seen that affecting like the information inflow into the Beltway area?
Yes. I think that has an effect in the sense that stories and reporting itself gets more narrow. There's a lot of things that just simply are not being reported. And it's to appeal, it's for clicks. It's for clicks. And I even know a particular individual who works for a major news outlet here in DC. And she told me, you know, everything that one of the first things that they do every day is they talk about how many clicks their particular story got. So that is what is driving journalism in today's age. And that is extremely regrettable, because then all you're going to get is it becomes much more sensationalistic, and you're missing out on key facts, key stories, and you're just trying to appeal to certain segments that are just going to click on that story. And that is not the job of the fourth estate, not in a free society.
Now, there's a really good question on our queue. There are many more violent conflicts in the world, with many more deaths and injuries than the Arab-Israeli conflict. And why do you think the media spends so much more time on this conflict, this relatively minor conflict, while ignoring other far more deadly conflicts?
That's a fantastic question. In a word, Jews. No Jews, no news, as the old saying is. And I think that is, I think that's correct. There's this fixation on Jews, and today on the Jewish state, which is extremely disproportionate. I mean, this is a country of 8.5 million. It is it's an important country and whatnot. There are many, as you noted, other conflicts that are unfolding throughout the world that don't even receive anywhere near as much coverage. And that is a huge problem. And I think the reason behind it is anti-Semitism, effectively, whether subconscious or otherwise. I think that there's this fixation on Jews and the Jewish state, and sometimes it's on saying what they can or can't do, as if they're still in, shtetl. And I think that's where that comes from.
Right. Now, one of the things that I've always has bothered me is I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Zaire, which is now known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And during their civil war, there was more than 5 million deaths as a result of that conflict. And there was hardly any coverage. Is there, when you talk to reporters about this, and I don't know if you do, is there any way for people to correct that, do you think? To somehow say, maybe you might want to cover the conflict in Syria with a little bit more resources?
That's a fantastic, I have brought that up to a particular editor at a major outlet. And his response was, those stories aren't what people are interested in. They don't get the clicks. So in this sense, it's not only just the news outlets, but it's the public writ large and what they're interested in. And there's an obsession there with Jews and the Jewish state that goes beyond newsrooms. So that, I think, is also part of it. And then the other fact on a more practical level is that it's very dangerous to report from, say, the Congo or from Syria. But it's pretty safe to report from Jerusalem, especially compared to the rest of the Middle East. So that also enables disproportionate news coverage.
And the food's better, too.
The food is way better.
The restaurants are cleaner, I can tell you that. But
I bet.
And so I think at this point, I'm looking, okay, let's see. There's a question, do we have to pay for publishing articles in the newspapers that we submit to? And
no, I've never received a dime, and Cameron's never received a dime. So no, we get by on our own merits.
Right.
Some that might not always be the case with other individuals or
right.
actual lobby.
But the question is, do we pay? And the answer is no, we don't. And we may buy ads in a paper, so to speak, but we don't. Yeah. Now, what about you had mentioned earlier in some of the Khashoggi story. Do you want to talk about that and how that got played out, or?
Right. So in brief, there was a Washington Post columnist named Jamal Khashoggi. He was a Saudi dissident who was residing in the United States, and also he had a place in Turkey as well. So he was murdered in a Saudi consulate in Turkey. We don't know all the details, but it seems increasingly clear that he was murdered by the orders of Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, for being a dissident. So as a Washington Post columnist, he wrote mostly about being an Arab dissident, and he did also tweet, however, several anti-Semitic things. He made pro-Hamas statements. He had prior affiliations with the Muslim Brotherhood. He mourned Osama bin Laden's death in 2011. And so he has all this history of anti-Semitism and anti-American statements that preceded his being hired by the Washington Post. So the Post nonetheless hired him, which is something they've never answered for. And when he was murdered, after he's murdered, it was revealed that, in fact, he wasn't even writing most of his columns. They were being, quote, shaped by an individual from the Qatar Foundation. So Qatar, for those who don't know, is basically the enemy in the Gulf, or rival, if you will, of Saudi Arabia. The Qataris lean towards their resistance axis, which is comprised of Iran, Syria, and elements that are avowedly anti-Semitic and anti-Israel and anti-American. So the Qatar Foundation was shaping his columns that were appearing in the Washington Post. The Washington Post admitted that in what was more or less a news dump in a single sentence or two right before Christmas, roughly 2 years ago. So they briefly admitted it and never talked about it again. And they've never held an accounting for that. So I think that that is particularly damning in terms of the Post's credibility, especially the fact that they have not answered for it. And it's also revealing of how things really work. This was a guy who no doubt was a dissident. And of course, his murder was heinous and horrendous. But he wasn't even writing his columns in full. And that violates completely Washington Post ethics and standards and just basic journalistic decency. Yeah. But it is a preview. It is a window in terms of how things often really work behind the scenes.
Now, are they embarrassed? I mean, one of the questions is, what effect does social media have on fostering this type of journalism? And I'd like to amend that, fostering and countering this type of journalism. Does Twitter have an impact on these folks?
It does. It does. Very much so. Social media, I think, increases the bubble because of algorithms. So if you're a journalist and you're following and liking certain things, what is appearing on your feed is largely people that basically agree with you. You're also effectively choosing to follow certain people for certain reasons. So in a way, you're also limiting your own little worldview. It increases the bubble.
That's all the time we have for questions today, and I apologize for not getting to all of them. And so if you like today's conversation, we're going to have more interviews like this starting during the fall, and we're going to be releasing our fall schedule sometime in the next couple of weeks. Anyone interested in knowing more about Sean's talk can send an email to tracy@camera.org. That's TRACEY@camera.org. I hope you all enjoyed our presentation, and please allow me to wish you all a good health and a good day.